Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Elise Helford, and I'm a professor of English at MTSU. I also teach for women's studies and MTSU's Jewish and Holocaust Studies minor. If you want more information about those things, I'm going to sit up front and feel free to come up and tag me and ask me questions. MTSU hosts a biennial Holocaust Studies conference, and homosexuality and the Holocaust is definitely a topic that speakers and presenters bring to the conference. And the Holocaust Studies program is the sponsor of today's speaker. We are thrilled to bring together LGBTQIA+ studies and today's speaker, Dr. Jake Newsome. Before I introduce him, I also want to say that in connection with this, tomorrow when you're back and you need that free lunch, tomorrow, just before 11, lunch will be served. And then we will be showing a film called Paragraph 175, which is the name of the German anti-homosexual policy that, if you can imagine, during the Weimar period, which is before Hitler, so before 1933, Germany got very close to overturning its anti-sodomy law, into overturning it. And then Hitler. And I'll let Jake tell you all that and bring you from there all the way up to the present and activism. But the documentary will be showing tomorrow at 11 a.m. is a powerful film that will introduce you to a number of gay Holocaust survivors. They will tell their stories to a young man who's become a not quite as young man who works for the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. And he interviews these people in a unique documentary. I don't know any others like it, where you get to meet these individuals and hear their stories. And Dr. Newsome, an MTSU graduate student in our Master of Arts in Liberal Arts program, Caleb Franklin, will also be there to talk a little bit about the film and its importance and to answer any questions. So do please come back for that as a continuation of the discussion that will begin today. Today's speaker, Dr. Jake Newsome, is an award-winning scholar of German and American LGBTQ+ history. His work is dedicated to making high-quality scholarship accessible. And we know what that means, right? If we're students, you want to read it as opposed to you have to read it. And it's not a textbook, but a very wonderful, readable book that'll give you a great history. And copies of the book are being sold in the lobby. By shining light on the LGBTQ+ past, Dr. Newsome seeks to guide learners through study in the history of LGBT issues to develop an ethical sense of compassion and wrestle with the ideals and challenges of responsible citizenship. His new book, in the lobby, Pink Triangle Legacies, coming out in the shadow of the Holocaust from Cornell University Press, traces the transformation of the Pink Triangle from a Nazi concentration camp badge into a global symbol of pride. The Lambda Literary Foundation named it as one of its most anticipated new LGBTQIA+ books of 2022. In addition to serving as a historical advisor for film projects, exhibits, and plays, Dr. Newsome has been invited by the French, the UK, and the US governments to speak about the important lessons that LGBTQ+ history has for all of us today. He currently works as a museum professional in Washington, D.C. I am now honored to welcome Dr. Newsome to MTSU's 2023 LGBTQ+ College Conference and to this stage where he will present on the legacy of the Pink Triangle. Here's another.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I hope that you had a chance to grab some lunch because while we're here nourishing our minds, it's really important to keep our bodies nourished as well. So I want to first thank Elise for that introduction and to all the staff and the team running the conference. It's been just really wonderful learning opportunity for me myself this morning as well. And so I'm just really honored to be a part of it. I'm also just appreciative that all of you have shown up. I know your lives are busy, and so I'm grateful to share this space with all of you who are here in person and for those of you who are tuning in online. So lastly, I just want to thank the Middle Tennessee's Holocaust Studies program for sponsoring the keynote and for the LGBT plus college conference, not just for the invitation to share my work with all of you, but also for all the work that you do each and every year to support the queer community here in Tennessee. Now, this week and next week, institutions all over the world will be pausing to commemorate the Holocaust Days of Remembrance, which is a chance for the world to commemorate and memorialize the victims of the Holocaust. The Days of Remembrance and the ceremonies associated with them are rooted in the belief that there is power in truth-telling, right? That there is power in preserving memory. And so that's what I'm here to talk with you about this afternoon, is the power of telling the truth, right? The power of giving voices to histories that have been hidden for so long. Now, I never knew about the Holocaust until I went to college. I'm not Jewish, so I didn't kind of learn about it through my family's anecdotes or family's history. We didn't learn about it in high school, unfortunately. And so it was, like I said, when I was kind of sitting where you are as a college student, was the very first time that I learned about the history of the Holocaust. And afterwards, I just started taking every course that I could, every course that my university offered on the history of the Holocaust or Nazi Germany or World War II, trying to understand this really pivotal moment in human history. But it wasn't until the very last semester on campus that a guest professor came and gave a talk titled Hitler's Pink Triangle Prisoners. Right? And this was a talk about the gay men who were sent to concentration camps and marked with a pink triangle on their badge. And it suddenly occurred to me that in the course of my 4 years of studying, I hadn't learned anything about this particular group, except for maybe like one bullet point in all the books that would say, oh yeah, and homosexuals were persecuted. I was extra angry or frustrated at myself because this was also a point in time when I was in the process of coming out and trying to figure out what does it mean to be gay, where do I fit in with the world, and where do I fit in with history. So I had never stopped to think or ask what happened to people like me during the Nazi regime. And when I finally started asking professors on campus, what happened to queer people during the Holocaust? Well, first of all, my advisor told me, thanks for waiting until you're 2 weeks away from graduating to ask this question. We don't have any time left in the semester to cover it. But essentially, I was told that LGBTQ folks were one of the so-called forgotten victim groups of the Nazi regime. Right, that supposedly after the war, homophobia remained such a taboo that no one talked about it, right? Not the survivors themselves, not the military officials, not government officials. And so how can you write a history with absolutely no evidence? And so for whatever I was, like 22-year-old Jake at the time, that made perfect sense. Like you can't write a history if you don't have archival evidence to write it with. So I then went on to graduate school. I went from South Georgia up to Buffalo, New York, which was quite a shock. And then I went to Germany to begin researching for really the project that turned into this book. And when I got to the archives, I thought that I was going to find nothing at all because that's what I had been told. But you can imagine my surprise then when I ended up finding mountains and mountains of material on the topic. Everything from survivor diaries and letters, court records from the German government, allied military records from the US military, journalist accounts, and even some published historical scholarship. So here I am now asking a new set of questions. I thought there was nothing here, and now I'm finding so much that I don't know what to do with. and even the fact that some scholars, some historians in the 1970s had started to comb through this material and publish books about it. I think it's important to note that the handful of books that I did find were all written by LGBTQ folks themselves. So this really changed my research question. I thought I was going to write a book about what happened to queer people in Nazi Germany from 1933 to 1945, right? A really nice start and end date. But suddenly I found myself trying to wade through the question of if this archival material exists, and if some historians have even started to write about it, how had it not been integrated into mainstream Holocaust education in the early 2000s? So what began as a question about certain historical events ultimately became a project about what happens when a society ignores the suffering of an entire group of people. It answers questions like, what are the legacies of collective forgetting? But on the other hand, what types of futures can we collectively build by remembering an accurate portrayal of the past? So to trace this history, which then, now the book covers not just 12 years in one country, but over 100 years in multiple countries, I traced the history of a symbol that was at the heart of everything, and that was the pink triangle. And I also thought it was just really fitting and interesting that the logo for the conference also involves a pink triangle. And so this is clearly still a relevant symbol for the LGBTQ community. But before I can talk about the pink triangle's legacies, I need to talk about the pink triangle's origins. Now, by the early, okay, let me make sure that can we go to the next slide, please? Well, while we're getting that worked up, by the early or the late 1920s and early 1930s, there was a small right-wing fringe party in Germany called the Nazi Party, and they were beginning to gain considerable power throughout the country. And in fact, in 1932, they became the largest political party in Germany. And in January of 1933, the leader of that party, Adolf Hitler, was appointed chancellor of the country. Now, this new Nazi government wanted to create supposedly a racially pure society. They wanted to remake Germany fashioned out of their own Nazi ideals. And it labeled several groups as not belonging to this new German society. So some groups the Nazis felt posed such a deep biological threat that there was nothing left to do with those groups except for completely get them out of German land, German society, and ultimately life itself. Right? So these groups included primarily the Jews, but also Roma and Sinti, and people with disabilities. Right? The Nazis felt that they were so deeply, allegedly tainted that they had to be physically eliminated, and therefore their policies against those groups evolved into genocide. But there were other groups that the Nazis targeted as enemies of the state, but they felt that these other groups of Germans could be essentially forced to give up or change their behavior or their beliefs, and then could be reintegrated back into German society. So these other groups included folks like political opponents, Freemasons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and folks that we would today recognize as members of the LGBTQ community. Now, the Nazi leadership were obsessed with understanding and then controlling human sexuality, right? Because this was, as they viewed it, was literally the key to breeding or reproducing a master race, right? So the threat that the Nazis saw the LGBTQ community as posing to Germany was essentially a threat to the German birth rate. Right? They believed that queer people robbed the German fatherland of offspring, of children, of the next generation of good Nazis. The Nazis also didn't believe that people were born LGBTQ. They believed that it was a choice, it was a vice that anyone could be tempted into. And in fact, that's why they believed it was so dangerous, because it wasn't just a kind of subset of the community, but it was a lifestyle that anyone could be tempted into, which actually means everyone could be tempted into. Now, this misunderstanding of human sexuality meant that non-Jewish LGBTQ folks were not sent by the Nazis straight to the gas chambers, right? But as we'll see, the Nazis' policies against queer people were in fact deadly. And the Nazis made it clear in their campaign, on the campaign trail, and as well as once they got into power, that there was going to be absolutely no room for what they called the homosexual lifestyle in the new Germany that they sought to build. Now, one of the very first things that the Nazis did when they came to power, I'm sorry, I'm usually just a lecturer and like a walker. So standing behind this is just, it feels like I'm rooted down. So I'm gonna walk. One of the very first things that the Nazis did when they came to power was control access to information, right? So they immediately banned all LGBTQ publications. And in doing so, they removed the only platforms or the only media outlets in which LGBTQ people could speak for themselves, right? So at the same time, the Nazis also ramped up their propaganda that essentially played on ordinary Germans' fears and feelings by claiming that LGBTQ folks were out to essentially seduce Germany's children into joining this homosexual lifestyle, right? So it was not just we are against this community, but it was a rhetoric of we have to protect our youth, right? Because if we don't protect them, who else will? Now, the Nazis also targeted anyone whose gender or sexuality didn't conform. Can we go to the next slide, please? Didn't conform to their kind of narrow ideals of what gender should be. So the Nazis targeted transgender people. They wouldn't have confirmed that transgender people existed. They didn't believe that a transgender identity was legitimate. They would have treated trans folks as simply cross-dressers. So a lot of transgender people were arrested under Germany's law paragraph 183, which was essentially a law against disturbing the peace in the public, because the Nazis believed that going out in public wearing the quote unquote wrong clothes was causing a public nuisance. Next slide, please. Now, the Nazis also targeted lesbians and other queer women. They did so under a wide range of laws and policies. And we know that lesbians were also sent to concentration camps like Henny Sherman, who you see on the screen here. But out of all of the folks in the LGBTQ community, the Nazis believed that queer men were the most dangerous. And this is because, like in most countries in the Western world at the time, it was men who had positions of power, right? Men were the leaders in the economy, in the military, and in national politics. So therefore, any so-called deviance in a man would pose more of a direct threat to the everyday running of the government. So the biggest tool that the Nazis had in their toolbox against queer men was a law called Paragraph 175. This was a law that already existed when the Nazis came to power. It had actually been written into the German criminal code when Germany was united as a country in 1871. So it was about 60 years old when the Nazis came to power, and it explicitly criminalized same-sex behavior between men. But when the Nazis came to power, they felt that the way the original law was worded was too constricting on their ability to legally go after queer men. So in 1935, which is the same year, the same months even that they are writing the famous Nuremberg race laws, they amend paragraph 175. And so you can see the wording of this new law here on the screen. So I don't know if we have any like pre-law students here or lawyers, but I'm not sure how you legally define indecency. Right? But that was exactly the point. They wanted to leave this vague enough so that prosecutors and judges could interpret that however they wanted to, with the goal of being able to convict as many men as possible. Now, I will say that this law was used almost exclusively for non-Jewish queer men, because if, for example, you were queer and Jewish, and the Nazis apprehended you, essentially, in their eyes, your so-called crime of being Jewish was the worst one, right? So then they would have labeled you and treated you as Jewish, and it didn't necessarily matter what other so-called crimes you might be committing. Now, one of the things that I have found most shocking in my research was just how wildly popular the Nazis' homophobic and transphobic policies were. But ultimately, it probably shouldn't be so surprising because that's what fascism is. That's what fascism does, right? It's not just a way of organizing a government, top-down, dictatorial, way of running the government, but it also creates a social environment in which normal, everyday people feel empowered to tap into and act on their worst impulses. So we know from the records that Germans took it upon themselves to turn in queer people to the Nazis in staggering numbers. So, for example, if you look at the number of paragraph 175 convictions, out of all of those that did end up in a conviction, a third of them were the result of civilian denunciations. Right? So I'm talking about people's bosses or landlords or their neighbors, or in some cases, even their own family members, turning them into the Nazis. In total, the Nazis arrested about 100,000 queer men under paragraph 175, and 95% of those arrests came after their amendment of the law. So you can see very clearly that spike in the number of convictions. Over half of those men were convicted. We don't currently have comprehensive statistics of the number of queer women who were arrested during the Third Reich because, as I said, they were arrested under a number of different laws and policies, but scholars are currently going through the archives and trying to be able to give us a kind of comprehensive overview of just how many queer women were also wrapped up or victimized by the Nazis' LGBTQ policies. So anywhere between 7,000 and 10,000 so-called repeat offenders, so men who had been arrested more than once during this time period, were sent to concentration camps. And when any prisoner or any person was admitted into a concentration camp, the Nazis assigned them a color-coded triangle badge that had to be worn on their uniform that told not only the guards, but clearly the other inmates as well, why you were being imprisoned in the camps. So the men who were sent to camps for being gay were marked with a pink triangle. Now, we also know, as we saw before, lesbians and transgender people were also sent to concentration camps. They did not have their own separate category of triangle, but we also know that they were most often labeled with a black triangle. The black triangle was kind of a miscellaneous category that the Nazis used to label a whole range of so-called social deviants. So it was used to mark sex workers, people experiencing homelessness, people struggling with alcoholism, even people that the Nazis called chronically unemployed could be put into a camp and marked with the black triangle. But the records tell us that the prisoners with the pink triangle were often submitted to harder work details, because in the Germans' mind, hard work was a man's job, and somehow being submitted to something that was incredibly masculine or hard would somehow reorient these gay men back into being straight. The Nazis also paid physicians to undergo or undertake really violent, invasive medical experiments on gay prisoners as well, to try to find a so-called biological cure for the problem of homosexuality. But despite these official policies of re-education or curing these men and then releasing them back into the public. The reality, the statistics show a different reality. So out of all of the men who were sent to the camps and marked with the pink triangle, over 65% of them were killed in the camps, right? So clearly a big distinction between the official policy of re-education and the reality on the ground. Now, after the Allies defeated Nazi Germany in May of 1945, they suddenly found themselves having to care for hundreds of thousands of concentration camp survivors. They very soon implemented a policy where they would release all the prisoners who had been kept or incarcerated based on their race, religion, or politics. But they said, and this was led by the Americans, they said it was too dangerous to release so-called common criminals back into the general public. So they, perhaps not surprisingly, considered the prisoners with the pink triangle to be common criminals. So if there was any pink triangle prisoner left who had time left on their prison sentence, the Allied liberators would take them directly from the concentration camp to a nearby prison where they were forced to serve out the rest of their term. Now, at the same time, the Allies are trying to purge all of the Nazi laws out of the German criminal code and the Constitution, but they leave it up to the Germans to decide what to do with paragraph 175. So in 1949, Germany is split into two countries, East and West Germany. East Germany, which was the communist half that aligned itself with the Soviet Union, immediately reverted paragraph 175 back to its original wording, right, which was a little bit more lenient. West Germany, the democracy, right, our ally in the new Cold War, decided to explicitly and specifically keep the Nazi version of paragraph 175. So Pierre Sale, who was a gay concentration camp survivor in France, who was put into the camps during German occupation, stated really powerfully at the end of the war that liberation was only for others. Now, beginning immediately after the creation of West Germany, gay people challenged the constitutionality of paragraph 175 in court. Right, they said that it went against the country's new democratic constitution to continue using a Nazi version of an already discriminatory law. But the West German courts continuously rebuked any and all claims that fascism lived on in the law. And in fact, in 1957, the Federal Constitutional Court of the country issued a ruling once and for all that, again, the specifically Nazi version of that law was still necessary to protect the moral fortitude of the German people. But it turns out they didn't just keep it, right? They enforced it, they used it. So if you remember that graph that I showed just a few slides ago, if you extend that to show the full life of paragraph 175, this is what it looks like. Right, so clearly it goes down at the end of the war, but in 1949, when West Germany is established, those numbers go right back up. Now, debates around the constitutionality or the legality of paragraph 175 weren't the only places where ordinary Germans discussed or talked about the fate of the Nazis' LGBTQ victims. It also came up around discussions for or against compensation. So what you're seeing here is a letter written by a German man named Bruno Bouchard, who was arrested during the war under paragraph 175. He spent 4 years in prison and then survived the war and survived the Holocaust. So afterwards, he writes an application to be officially recognized as a victim of Nazi fascism. And this would be important because if he was officially recognized, that made him eligible for financial reparations, but also legal help in having his record expunged so that he could kind of get off of these blacklists and finally get a job, find housing, and be able to rebuild his life. Now, this compensation board rejects his claim and it states very explicitly that we are rejecting your application because you were arrested under paragraph 175. So Bruno does something pretty rare. He appeals that decision. In fact, he appeals it again and again and again, and it leaves a really rare paper trail in the archive. So what you're seeing is one of those appeals. And so you can see on the bottom left, he's So of course he's typed the letter, but then he has underlined that section to bring people's attention to it. And so I've translated that here for you. Essentially, he tells the board that let's forget paragraph 175. The only reason that the Nazis let me out of the prison and didn't send me to a concentration camp was because they made me submit myself to so-called voluntary castration. So he says, such a brutal intrusion on a healthy human body was only possible in Nazi Germany and should be enough to convince you that I was a victim of fascism. Now, this board, unfortunately, was not convinced. They rejected his claim again and then sent the cops after him, right? Because this, remember, paragraph 175 is still in effect. Now, I want to show you a clip. Show you a clip from the documentary Paragraph 175, which we're going to show tomorrow, of a man named Heinz F. He goes on record only giving his first name. It's about 3.5 minutes long. It's in German, but there are English subtitles. And this is him talking about his experience after the war. So I'm not sure if it'll start.
Was haben Sie gemacht? Was haben Sie gemacht, als Sie zurückkamen? Ja, wegen nach Hause kamen. Ja. Können Sie Ihrem Bruder oder Ihrer Mutter erzählen, was passiert ist in dem Laden? Ich kann mit meiner Mutter nicht darüber gesprochen. Mein Vater nicht sprechen, aber warum? Das war meine Mutter hat nie was gesagt. Aus Scham worüber Aber das kann ich mir vorstellen, dass diese schrecklichen Jahre überlebt haben und zurückkamen und that were away from God. Kennen Sie noch darüber gesprochen? Haben Sie später mit anderen sprechen können? So war auch keiner, der war groß. Ja, stimmt, war es nach. Aber es ist klar, es ist viel. Ja, vorbei.
So it's a really powerful testimony from Heinz. Clearly really emotional for him even decades after it happened. But one of the things that I think makes Heinz's story even more heartbreaking is the fact that it's just one out of thousands. At the beginning, I mentioned how folks had told me the LGBTQ folks were victims of forgotten victims of the Nazi regime. But even from just looking at these two examples, we can see that no one had forgotten what happened to them. Germans, in fact, knew what had happened to queer people, and in many cases agreed with it. The German people and the German government continued to discriminate and persecute this community. So some men, like Bruno from the previous slide, decided to break their silence. They told their story, but people in positions of authority used that power to silence him, right? By telling him that he was not a real victim, but instead that he was a criminal. As we just saw, the stifling environment of homophobia forced many men like Heinz here to keep his own memories hidden, even from his family. So writing this book has taught me a lot about the nature of silence. When I first started, I always thought about silence as a noun, right? The lack of something, the lack of sound, the lack of memories. But what we're seeing is silence as a verb, right? To silence someone, to keep someone quiet. So West German courts and police, even professional historians and judges, all had silenced LGBTQ victims for decades after the end of the Holocaust. But thankfully, queer activists were about to break that silence once and for all. Now, in the early 1970s, a political gay liberation movement emerged in West Germany. Activists in this new movement sought to mobilize queer people across the country into political action. And at this time, the act of coming out, right, of publicly claiming an LGBTQ identity was seen as not just a personal decision, but as a political tactic as well. Because in the past, activists had argued for the right to privacy. Right? Essentially, they argued that the government shouldn't persecute LGBTQ folks as long as they stayed in the privacy and indeed the safety of the metaphorical closet. But the politics of coming out asserted, on the other hand, that citizens in a democratic country had the right to express their sexuality openly and freely. So these West German gay activists suggested that they all collectively out themselves by wearing a gay symbol. Right. And of course, that raised many questions about what would that be? What type of symbol out there in the world symbolizes being gay? Well, in 1972, a really small, slim book was published in Hamburg. It was written under the pseudonym Heinz Hager, and it was the very first story, very first book, at least, published by a gay concentration camp survivor to tell their story. So the title, which translated in English as The Men with the Pink Triangle, offered a solution to this question of visibility. Now, activists knew that their West German colleagues, their co-workers, the general public would instantly recognize the pink triangle as a concentration camp symbol. It would thus face West German society with the fact that their recent history wasn't all the way in the past. So in 1972, a small leftist radical queer liberation group in Frankfurt, Germany, called Rot Schwul, became the very first organization in the world to reclaim the pink triangle and use it as a symbol of queer liberation. Now, these West German activists knew that their reclamation of the pink triangle was a fundamental transformation of not just a particular symbol, but of an identity as well. Right, so the original pink triangle had labeled being gay as something that was essentially unhuman, right? It was criminal, worthy of being punished. But these activists reclaimed it and said that being gay is in no way shameful, and it's not going to be an insult anymore. And in fact, we are going to now wear this pink triangle badge as a symbol of our pride. Now, the reclamation of the pink triangle originated in West Germany, but it didn't stay there for very long. In August of 1974, the Gay Activist Alliance in New York City were organizing a protest for a gay rights bill in the city, and they designed and wore these pink triangle pins. And it was the very first documented instance of the pink triangle's use in political activism in the United States. From there, it spread all across the country, right? Queer activists used the pink triangle as a symbol, but also as the history that it represented to call out homophobia and to promote equality. They did so from New York, DC, Miami, San Francisco, and then really everywhere in between. And in America too, just like in Germany, activists understood that their use of the pink triangle was reclaiming something, right? It was transforming something that was negative into something that was powerfully positive. And the lesbian Jewish activist Martha Shelley also told me in an interview that the pink triangle had the added benefit of giving the middle finger to the Nazis. Now, by the mid-1980s, the pink triangle had become the most widely used and recognizable symbol of queer activism, not just in North America, but across Europe as well. It was taken up by queer people from different ethnicities and backgrounds, as well as different gender expression, gender identities, and sexual orientations. But it was in 1986 that a group of activists and artists in New York City catapulted the pink triangle into the public consciousness in a new way when they designed this now iconic silence equals death poster, right? This was a poster that was meant to motivate people into action during the deadly AIDS crisis beginning in the 1980s. A month later, after the AIDS activist group ACT UP adopted the poster as their own, the pink triangle quickly became not just a North American or European symbol, but one that was truly global. But the pink triangle was never only about politics. Transgender activist Nancy Nangeroni, for example, told me that there was a lot of homophobia in the trans community in the 1990s, as well as transphobia in the gay community. So she tried to build bridges and coalitions between these two communities by using symbolism, right? So she designed this pin. She also put it on t-shirts, right, that combine a transgender symbol with the pink triangle. And it was an element of intersectionality that also prompted Jose Gutierrez to form Triangulo Rosa, which was a gay support group for Latina gay men in Washington, D.C., beginning in the 1990s. And Jose has spoken so powerfully about why, what and how the pink triangle has meant to him as a Mexican American who had no direct connection to the pink triangle's origins in Germany. Jose said that he felt connected to it because the pink triangle had come to represent a gay community, indeed a gay identity that transcended national borders and had a shared history. Now, for Black and queer writer Cheryl Head, it was that history that gave the symbol its power. The first time that she saw the pink triangle in the United States was on one of those silence equals death poster, but she told me that for her, it would never have been as meaningful or as effective as an activist symbol if she hadn't already known the history. Unfortunately, even in the 80s, that history was still under attack. Professional historians and museums, academic journals, all refused to publish the research that queer scholars had already begun conducting and sharing with the public beginning in the 1970s. Even in 1996, a state archive in Hamburg, this is what you're seeing a newspaper clipping of, got caught destroying case files of the Nazis' gay victims in order to make room for what they said was more archive-worthy material. As I said, it's since the 1970s, a handful of grassroots scholars have risked their reputations and their livelihoods to research this history and try to get it beyond just the queer community, to get it accepted in mainstream society and the historical profession. So to this day, this is still a very small group of us who are working on preserving, writing, sharing this history. And my book would not be possible without the work of the folks that you see here on the screen. Now, in 2002, the German government finally recognized the men persecuted under paragraph 175 as official victims of the Nazi regime. And that also meant that they were finally eligible for compensation. But after that 2002, no gay survivor came forward. And you have to, I'm really bad at math, I'm a historian, but you can do the math and see that the youngest survivors would have been at least in their mid-80s. And you also know that, right, under a Nazi German government, an Allied occupation, the West German government, and now under the United German government, they had been told that everything that happened to them was not persecution or injustice, but was instead a permissible punishment for violating a crime. So to this day, no gay survivor has received a single penny of official compensation from the German government. So now we come to the conclusion of the talk. If I were to ask folks in this room, or maybe folks walking by in the hallway, what the symbol of the LGBTQ community is, probably folks wouldn't answer the pink triangle, right? We would talk about the rainbow. But it turns out that the rainbow flag was actually created in direct contradiction to or opposition to the pink triangle. In 1978, activists in San Francisco said that the pink triangle was focusing too much on a negative history, and they instead wanted something that was more uplifting that the LGBTQ community could take pride in. So what they developed was the very first rainbow flag that flew in San Francisco during the Gay Pride Parade that weekend. By the late 1980s, it had spread from San Francisco to the East Coast, and especially was adopted by a lot of LGBTQ folks who felt that some parts of the gay rights movement, namely ACT UP, which was symbolized by the pink triangle, had become too radical. So you fast forward to today, and the rainbow flag has achieved a level of visibility, not just within the queer community, but beyond the queer community in a way that the pink triangle simply never did. But I would argue, in order for it to become so widespread and accepted, it has also have to be tamed, right? In order for it to be more accepted, it had to become less radical. So in a lot of ways, this symbol, the rainbow, which had been born out of a symbol of LGBTQ pride, has now been turned into a PR tool and a marketing tactic. Right? Each June, you have seen it. All of the big corporations turn their logos into rainbows. They might even feature a same-sex couple in their commercials. They make tons of money, but then are really eerily silent when state governments start dismantling LGBTQ rights. July comes around and all of the rainbows disappear. But despite the cliches, there's not always a rainbow at the end of every storm. In the 1920s and the early 1930s, when Germany was still a democracy, there were a number of conservative political parties all vying for votes. They all had different stances on politics, on the economy, and cultural issues. But the Nazis revved up their homophobic and transphobic rhetoric because they knew that doing so would rile up their base on the one hand, and on the other, unite the right in a way that other issues simply wouldn't. And it worked. Now, does all of this sound a little familiar? Homophobia and transphobia has long been a tool of fascism. It's not a coincidence that today we are seeing a resurgence of white supremacy, extreme nationalism, violent anti-Semitism, book burning, and the worst, not just 1, 2, but 3 years on record for anti-LGBTQ legislation. In today's era of the Republicans don't say gay laws, we need the pink triangle more than ever. Right? If we are to truly honor those who were forced to originally wear the pink triangle, we have to do 3 things. First, we have to remember, right? We have to tell the truth about what happened. We have to free this history from the closet. This can no longer be a history that only only those of us in the LGBTQ community know and preserve and share. It has to get beyond our community. Because when we separate LGBTQ victims from the history of the Holocaust, people don't realize how dangerous and indeed lethal homophobia can be when it's backed by the government. But remembering is not enough. Remembering must have consequences. So second, we, including we in this room, have to act, right? We have to push back against homophobia, even when it's around the kitchen table, in the workplace, with your friends. We have to fight transphobia, yes, of course, on election day, but we have to do so every day. Finally, we have to show up, not just for our own community, but for each other. We have to recognize that the fight against homophobia also has to be the fight against anti-Semitism and racism and ableism and all of the other forms of marginalization and dehumanization. Because none of us here in this room live our lives in tidy, neat little boxes. So our activism can't be either. I want to leave you with this final message. The LGBTQ community today has every right to exist, and not just quietly in the closet, but visibly in public, in history books, in high school curriculum, on library shelves, on drag stages, on books and movies, every single way that we as a society talk about and understand the world and our place in it, we have a right to be there. But we have to actively fight like hell to protect those rights, because the history of the pink triangle reminds us of what can happen if we don't. Thank you very much. I think we have some time for questions. Yes, we got the thumbs up.
Yes, I got it here. I will. I may need a break and you can take it. Okay. Just put your arm out and I'll grab the questions. Every Trent. Wave your hand good, okay.
Was there a difference in how the individuals that was jailed treated based upon their ethnicity and their position within the German culture?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. Thank you. So absolutely in Germany, those who were considered to be Aryan, right, or full-blooded ethnic German would have been treated with the most privilege or the least amount of violence. So there are examples of German men who were non-Jewish, who were educated in the German system, who were arrested 1, 2, even 3 times, and were not sent to the concentration camps. And I think that one of the ways that we can understand why that might have happened is because, yes, they were seen as undesirable because they were gay, but also, I'm thinking of one case in particular. He was a business owner and employed a lot of people. He was, good German white. He was Protestant. He spoke several languages. So in a lot of ways, he checked all the boxes of like what a good German should look like. He just had this one supposed problem. That type of leniency was not offered to people who were considered not ethnically German, right? So Jewish people, for example. There was a Black population in Germany as well, especially as a result of Germany's colonialism. Now, that is something that I've only just started researching. Were there cases of queer Germans of color who are also wrapped up in these laws? Some of the earliest findings that I have come across in the archives is that Germans, the Nazis, were not as interested in enforcing these types of laws against essentially people they considered non-German. So my hypothesis is that if there was, for example, an Afro-German who was caught, in a queer relationship, they would have been sent back to essentially the colonies and not put into the concentration camps, at least not for being gay. The Nazis did send lots of Black Germans to the concentration camps for being Black, but I don't know. I haven't yet figured out if there's the kind of intersectional overlap of Black queer experiences in Germany. Thank you.
Hi, Jake. Thank you for that great presentation.
Thank you.
My question is, the Nazis persecuted gay men because they perceived them as a threat because they saw it as a choice.
Mm.
You fast forward to 2020 today here in Tennessee, and the governor signed a bill banning drag shows. It seems like it's the same premise there, that they feel like it's a choice that might sway people to the other team, like the Nazis were afraid of. There seems like there used to be a time when if you pointed out to people that their beliefs compared to murderous genocidal Nazis, that caused light bulbs to go off and maybe caused people to consider what they were doing. That doesn't somehow seem to be the case anymore. What are your thoughts on that?
No, you're right. It used to be where being put into the same category as Nazis was viewed as a bad thing. Unfortunately, I think it comes down to a couple of things. Those in power on the right probably haven't really learned a whole lot about the Nazi persecution of queer people. They might have, of course, even when I first started studying this topic, it wasn't super surprising to me that the Nazis went after queer people, because it seems like the Nazis went after everybody, right? But once you start diving into the details and learning why the Nazis targeted LGBTQ folks, you see that some of that same rhetoric isn't unique to Nazis. It predated the Nazis and also existed long after the Nazis. So you're right. When we're listening to the news and we see politicians talking about LGBTQ folks, especially trans people, are groomers, right? They're going to groom your children into this lifestyle. That is nothing new, right? That has been a fascist talking point at least since the 1930s. And I think if more people understood that, hopefully it would sway not just public opinion, but the outcome. Maybe I'm putting way too much hope in education, right? But the fact that most people just don't even know what exact rhetoric the Nazis were using and how far that can go, right? How far words can go. Because if you remember, I mean, if you think about it, what we're seeing today, all of these policies and laws that are being enacted all across the country, this is a result of the 2016 elections, right? Back in 2016, people were just saying these things, like they were on the campaign trail talking about, how dangerous LGBTQ essentially existence is. But now those folks are in office and they're able to turn their words into reality, into policies. And so I think if we had a better understanding, not just that, persecution happened in the past, but how and why it happened, it should do two things. I would hope that it would shame some of these politicians into rethinking their issues, but it should also be a blueprint for those of us who are trying to fight it. Yeah, so thanks for that question.
I'm going to pop in a question from the chat. Do you feel that there are still written firsthand testimonies of homosexuals that have not been discovered and/or have purposely been hidden? Essentially, do you think there will ever be more than the handful of testimonies we've had for decades?
The short answer is yes. There are still scholars out there scouring archives, scouring people's attics and closets, finding written information that is slowly, if you're aware of academic publishing, it takes a long time. So even if someone finds it might be 10 years before it shows up in a book or an article. But there is a number of incredible queer feminist scholars in the United States and Europe who are uncovering these stories and getting them out into the public. If you want to look into the work of Laurie Moorhofer and Anna Haikova, for example, these are folks who are sharing and uncovering these individual stories. And one of the things that I'm really thankful for those scholars is helping us understand other queer experiences and other queer voices besides gay men. Because even when we talk about kind of LGBTQ Holocaust history, a lot of the information is not all LGBTQ. It's about gay men, right? And that's for a lot of different reasons that we can get into if you want to. But the new research is helping us understand gender nonconforming people, for example, and transgender experiences in a way that simply wasn't available before. So quick plug, if you are interested in reading more or even watching YouTube videos about individual stories of LGBTQ folks during the Holocaust, you can go to my website. It's wjakenewsome.com and go to /stories. And there I have a project now that is uploading these individual biographies of queer people. So we've got 7 up there now, but we're working on more. But these are stories that have not otherwise been told. So thanks for that question from online. I think we've got a couple of questions here on this side.
I was going to ask about the rhetoric of LGBT plus people being groomers, etc., and the Nazis using that. Was that existing rhetoric at the time that they amplified, or was that something that was specifically created and distributed by the Nazis?
That's a good question, and I'm not 100% sure of the answer. So the question was, right, did the Nazis kind of invent this almost kind of proto-groomer rhetoric, or did they just kind of amplify it? And I think it was probably like a little bit of both. It was like probably one fed into the other. So the Nazis they understood that they didn't have to invent homophobia, right? That it existed in German society and all they had to do was fan the flames. So for example, one of the people that I didn't mention in the presentation was a guy named Ernst Röhm, who was a high-ranking Nazi official who was also gay. And after he became a political liability, Hitler had him murdered. It had nothing to do with the fact that this guy was gay, but Hitler also recognized a propaganda opportunity when he saw it. So he used that. He went on the national radio and told everyone that we found out that there was this gay guy in our ranks and I had him murdered. And he didn't even hide it. He just said, I was the judge, jury, and executioner, and I had him murdered because I am here to protect the German people from this dangerous lifestyle. And he specifically then next said, mothers and fathers should not have to fear sending their kids to the Hitler Youth or to the SA. Right. So again, knowing that he can play up on this fear that homosexuals are predators, they're going to go after your children and maybe even try to convert them into the lifestyle. It was incredibly effective, so effective, which leads me to believe that the Germans didn't need much propaganda at all, right? There are examples, one in Hamburg in 1936, where a newspaper actually had to run a front page article asking German citizens to quit turning in so many queer people to the Nazis, that they were overburdening the local police office. Right, so clearly Germans are recognizing that they can use their voice and activate the power of the government. They're not waiting on Nazis to tell them what to do. They're like just going gung ho with it themselves.
Nothing. Oh. Yeah, I wasn't looking behind.
So you had mentioned that there had been an expansion and broadening of the language in paragraph 175 to where it was intentionally vague. And I can't help but see a little bit of a parallel to the recent anti-drag bill in Tennessee, where it's so intentionally vague that it can very clearly also be used to target gender nonconforming people, trans people, etc. Do you happen to see any other parallels in sort of the development of legislation that sort of parallels from pre-Nazi Weimar Republic and modern America?
No, that's a really good question. And that's where these types of questions, I think, are where the detailed historical research are important to be able to identify actually what were the types of laws that were being passed when Germany was still a democracy and in that transition to dictatorship. Because I think that's one of the things that folks often forget is that the Nazis, there wasn't a violent coup. They tried to take over the government by armed insurrection, but they lost. Right. And then the Nazis understood, okay, we've got to do this through the ballot box, which is horrifying and scary. The Nazis were able to use the tools of democracy to dismantle democracy itself, right? They did it through passing laws that were vague enough that gave them loopholes to assert their own narrow view of society and back that up by the full weight of the government. So you ask about maybe some other examples. I couldn't help but think about the Florida's Don't Say Gay bill, right? That said you can't talk about things that are not age appropriate. Like trying to define appropriate is almost like trying to define indecency. Like how in the world do you do that, right? So of course the DeSantis and all of his goons are like, well, you know what we mean by that, and we're not going to overstep our bounds. We're really just going to try to police it, in like kindergarten. But we've already seen that was one of the very first laws, right, that got the national attention. And we've already seen that they've overstepped they've gone beyond their stated intentions at the beginning. So and then one of the things I'm not a current like legal expert, and it makes me, maybe I should go to law school and try to understand what's going on. But like how quickly after some of these first laws passed, it was like a domino effect, and it's everywhere now, which tells me that it's got to be some type of like concerted effort where organizations are going around and giving templates to these state legislatures and saying, look, it worked in Florida or it worked in the Carolinas, whatever. We know that it can be passed here because it's just going so quickly. So one of the things that to kind of back it up to your question of Weimar Germany, right? Germany had this like 18-year period where they were a democracy. It was called the Weimar Republic. And during that time, queer people, especially in the big urban centers like Berlin, had built an unprecedentedly vibrant community for themselves, right? Berlin was an unofficial queer capital of the world. Like people came from London and New York and Paris to experience this queer culture in Berlin. One can assume that they thought that, hey, we're living in a democracy now. We have these legal rights that we're slowly getting better, that things couldn't go backwards. But they spent 18 years building this community for themselves, and the Nazis came to power, and at least in Berlin, were able to destroy it and push it back underground in a matter of like 3 weeks, literally less than a month. So that is a lesson to us that just because a community wins certain rights doesn't mean that they can't be taken away, right? And that all progress is fragile, and it needs constant protection, constant enlivening, right? Just because you're in a democracy doesn't mean it's automatically better for marginalized people. In fact, this history teaches us that democracies are quite good at marginalizing communities, right? So thank you for that question.
I think we have time for one last question. Oh, we got some over here. I think Will has, are you waving for over here? Okay. He's pointing to you. Okay, you're on.
I used to be a Catholic priest. I'm still Catholic, but I'm not a priest anymore because I'm married to Bill. The triangle, when I see the triangle, that's Trinitarian for me. So, I mean, in Celtic art, in a lot of places, that imagery is used to represent God and Trinity. But why a triangle is what I mean. I know that Nazism was entrenched in Christianity and to our own shame, but did you see connections with that, or is there been much research on that?
That is a really good question that I feel like I probably should have the answer to. But I just don't know. I don't know why the Nazis ultimately chose triangles as the shape for their concentration camp badges. I know from the beginning, so the very first concentration camp, so Hitler was appointed chancellor in January of 1933. The very first camp was opened in March of 1933. And it was front page news all across the country. It was not a secret. But from those very early years, we saw that picture of that chart. It was not so regimented at those early years. Essentially, each camp kind of came up with their own badging system, and sometimes they were just strips of colored cloth, sometimes they were circles. But it was in 1938 that they institutionalized and standardized these badges across the concentration camp system and started using that triangle system. And I just don't know. I don't know why they chose a triangle. That is certainly something that that I will look into, because I feel like now I should know that. But thank you for the question.
Okay, I think I get the last question. I'm curious whether you have seen much documentation about individuals who identify as bisexual as opposed to gay, lesbian, or transgender. Or did it appear that maybe they passed more in society and didn't get, ticked out quite as much?
Well, that's a really good question, and one that I struggled with as I was researching, but also writing, was like terminology. How do I talk about these folks who didn't use or didn't have even access to the terminology that we use today? So in a lot of cases, the Nazis would have essentially said any same-sex contact was all just like homosexual. So in the cases where, for example, paragraph 175 arrests and convictions, we don't know if those were all self-identifying gay men, or if they maybe could have been a bisexual man, or transgender women, because the Nazis would have considered a trans woman as just like a cross-dressing homosexual. So in a lot of ways, the Nazi classification system erases the possibility of seeing someone as like bi or in the middle. So one way to try to, at least that I've tried to, remedy that in my writing, is to try to, instead of using some of our contemporary labels, is just either, number one, use whatever term that person themselves used, or describe their actions, right? Because like this, this person was caught having sex with another man. I don't know if he, was gay, was he bi? It's kind of an imperfect way to write about this, but it's the way that I've tried to give that person, this historical person, as much agency as possible and representation as possible without assigning them a category that I don't know if that's what they would have used, and maybe I would get it wrong.
Let's show our appreciation to Dr. Newsome for his presentation.